Hi, I'm Alec Davis and welcome to Mediator Academy's roundup of mediation news from around the world. I think we each week try and be illuminating. I think we achieve that. I think we try and be informative. I think we definitely achieve that. But whether we achieve outrageousness, I don't know. But we'll certainly give it a go this week. Welcome to This Week in Mediation. My co-presenter on the show is Professor Nadia Alexander. Welcome, Nadia.
Hi, Alec. Very excited to be here for our bumper edition Christmas show.
Yes, I was going to pose question of the week to see whether our viewers could guess which time of year this show is being shot at, but now you've just ruined that one. We'll just jump straight into the content. What's coming up in the show today, Nadia?
Well, for our Christmas show, we have some special treats in store. For many people in the world, this time of year has a religious significance. So we're going to kick off the show by exploring conflicts with religious dimensions. And we will be hopefully hearing from Professor Michelle LeBaron, who recently organised an event at Trinity College in Dublin on this highly topical theme. Then we'll be looking at another theme that's closely connected to the end of the year in quite a few countries, in fact, and that is tax. We will specifically discuss an initiative of the US Internal Revenue Service called Fast Track Mediation. And then, finally, as a wrap-up to 2016, we highlight 5 global trends in mediation and we muse about some New Year's resolutions for 2017.
Thank you, Nadia. And I'm just mindful that as I nod my head in agreement, these things on top of my head just bounce up and down. So if that's a little distracting, don't worry, I'll be switching it over to my emergency hat shortly. So tell us about what was happening in Dublin last week.
Professor Michelle LeBaron from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, has long been working on the topic of conflicts with religious dimensions. And she's just spent 3 months at Trinity College in Dublin, and as part of her time there, last week brought together a small number of practitioners and thinkers from around the world who are currently engaged in a variety of conflict contexts, including in Northern Ireland, parts of Africa and in the Middle East.
So what was the focus of the meeting in Dublin then?
Well, it was really about exploring what it is that we need to understand better about conflicts with religious dimensions in order to engage more effectively in them. And I think if you just look around the world today, I mean, just about everything we read in the media or see on television seems to present us with a conflict which has an apparent religious dimension.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what came out of the meeting. Any insights about how we should be engaging in conflict that have religious dimensions?
Well, as you can imagine, the discussions were wide-ranging and quite intense. And although all of the participants were involved in these sorts of conflicts as professionals, either as interveners or as researchers, one of the interesting things was at the very beginning of the meeting, everybody shared something personal about their relationship to religion.
Okay, that's interesting. Why is that relevant? I mean, apart from obviously getting to know one another.
Well, I think it directly relates to the question of neutrality and impartiality. When we're dealing with religious conflicts, we're dealing with belief systems and worldviews of the people involved in them. And I think it's naive to assume that conflict resolution professionals, mediators, and even researchers who are ostensibly observing and objectively researching what's going on, I think it's naive to think that we turn up value-free to mediation. And so part of this sharing was about mediators being able to open up about their own beliefs, whether they are religious or not, and what that means, and how this has an impact on their interventions in any given conflict, and particularly those which deal with worldview and have religious elements. And in a way, I think this type of opening up by professionals in a mediation context can make mediators more vulnerable.
Go on. What do you mean?
Well, you're opening yourself up as a person, and you're not just presenting yourself as a professional wearing a mask of neutrality that supposedly protects you from all influence and prejudice.
So by acknowledging one's own values or bias, I guess, or values or bias, a mediator can be mindful of those prejudices and assumptions that they bring into the process, and therefore is better able to manage those. Now, is this particular to religious conflicts?
Yeah, really good question. And one of the discussion points at the meeting was about what do we mean when we say conflict with a religious dimension, and how useful is it to label a conflict as a religious conflict, for example. And I think the answer is that it's a double-edged sword. By putting a label on a conflict, whether it's religion or culture or politics or commerce, commercial mediation, for example, it's helpful to direct our attention to specific aspects of the conflict.
Such as religion.
Such as religion, if you label it a religious conflict. But at the same time, conflicts aren't exclusively about one dimension. They're not exclusively about religion, for example. And very often in these so-called religious conflicts, there are also intercultural, political, economic, interpersonal, community and power dynamics at play. And so it's important to be aware of all of these other dimensions, for the mediator, the intervener, to have this awareness, but also for participants to be aware of those in order for people to begin, I think, to move forward and make some progress towards resolution of some kind. And in fact, labelling a conflict as a religious conflict can also bring forth a lot of assumptions and prejudices on the part of all people involved, including the mediator. So, we tend to, if we think we're going into a religious conflict, we're more likely to focus on the religious-based assumptions and religious dimensions and neglect other aspects of it.
Okay, so in other words, by labelling a conflict as religious or intercultural or even economic, we're putting it into a box. Now, that might be helpful because it gives us a focus. It can help us navigate our way through the stormy seas. But as the double-edged sword that you were talking about, I think we also need to remember that that stormy sea isn't necessarily the entire ocean.
Absolutely right. So, as an example, Vietnam has just ratified a law on belief and religion. And it's a very controversial law. According to the South China Morning Post just this morning, this law has triggered renewed fears of state repression in the name of national unity. There were apparently unprecedented objections to the passing of this law from various religious groups, from the Interfaith Council of Vietnam, and even some objections from within the country's ruling Communist Party. So while this law certainly offers the potential for conflict with religious dimensions, and we can see that, I think it's also clear that it has very strong political dimensions, just as one example.
Yeah, so how do you as a mediator make sure that you don't get locked into just the one dimension of a conflict?
Great question. And conversations I had with various participants at this meeting led to a number of ideas in this regard. And one thing that came out strongly for me was that we need, as professionals, we need to spend more time in the gaps between the different dimensions of conflict. In other words, what happens in the space between religion and culture, between religion and economics, between religion and politics, and so forth. Michelle LeBaron talked about spending time on the edge or on the periphery as a professional. And I also talked to another participant, Patrick Hines, who's been involved in a number of conflicts with religious dimensions, most notably in Northern Ireland. And he talked about there not being any fixed mediation process in these sorts of conflicts, and that the process was something that needed to be built. And he explained that in his experience, this was done by paying attention to the spaces in between agenda items, in between the process steps, step 1, step 2, step 3 of mediation, in between the different substantive dimensions of the conflict. And he called these spaces the glue. the glue of the conflict engagement process. So without paying attention to these spaces where you can sort of, where you need to glue the bits together, the chances are that the whole peace process or the whole mediation is going to fall apart because it's not going to stick together. And I know Michelle LeBaron has written about this, and she, I think, would most likely call this a relational space, because it's relationships that build an effective intervention process and increase people's capacity and their resilience to work through these type of really intractable conflicts.
As you're talking, you know what springs to my mind?
Not at all.
Right. You know how if you've got a dentist appointment, and you kind of focus on brushing the surface area of your teeth.
Yes.
Where the most corrosion takes place is between the spaces between the teeth. So it sounds like it was like flossing in between the teeth kind of workshop.
That is and the most original metaphor I have heard in a long, long time. So it's the focus on flossing. We shouldn't forget to floss. And actually, in most training courses, we focus on brushing, right?
We do. We focus exclusively on brushing and not flossing, or brushing, then flossing, then brushing again.
Who does that?
I don't know, but it's a bit.
It's hard to take you seriously with your things bopping around, but I am trying very hard, Alec.
Brushing, flossing, and then rinsing.
All right.
Just
okay.
3 different processes, a bit like.
Up, mid, up.
Now then. Anyway, let's get back on track. So I think you've had a chance to speak to Michelle earlier about this. So should we go to that interview right now?
Yes, let's do that.
Well, hello, Michelle.
Well, hello, Alan. Hi, Nadia.
Hi, Michelle.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas, yes. Happy.
And wonderful to have you on the show.
Well, it's lovely to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
And it's a real privilege to meet you. Tell us a little bit about the gathering in Dublin the other week. What was the purpose of doing that, Michelle?
Well, the purpose was to bring people together who had been working in Northern Ireland in particular, but also the Republic of Ireland, on the aftermath and indeed the shift that led up to the Good Friday Agreement in the Troubles. Because the idea was that there's huge experience there about what's needed to create positive shifts in political and religious conflicts, and it might be productive, and indeed was productive, to explore those approaches that have been and are being used there in contrast to approaches being used elsewhere by people in Ireland who are working in other parts of the world, and then indeed by people in Europe, Canada, and the US.
Sounds wonderful.
So, Michelle, people working in this field, I mean, what sort of characteristics do you think are required for people to be effective conflict interveners in these type of conflicts with religious dimensions?
Well, Nadia, as you said earlier, we began the gathering with people talking about their own relationship to religion, and that, as you both would know and all of the listeners will know, is not a usual thing. We tend to think that if we have the skills, then what our personal beliefs are really doesn't matter that much and can be set aside. But actually, it's been my experience, and I think that of several others in the group last weekend, that if we're not aware of those things, and indeed not transparent with those things, then working with religious actors can be much more difficult. So I'm thinking, for example, of Jean-Nicolas Bitter from the government of Switzerland, who works a lot with Salafi actors. And Jean-Nicolas has a PhD in theology, as you know, and so his depth of understanding of theological perspectives makes a huge difference in his work with Salafi actors. And here I'm not suggesting that everyone who would would want to do this work or who would do this work would need a PhD in theology. That would be a huge bar to cross. But actually, I do think it's important that those of us who work in this area have given some serious thought to our own theologies, our own worldviews, and how we relate to religion, because there's a lot of backlash against religiosity in relation to violence committed in connection with religion, and yet there's so much that's really important and that contributes so much to our world, and I think we have to sort out our own relationships to all of that before we can be useful.
And so it takes us a long way from the disinterested, sort of emptied, neutral mediator idea, doesn't it?
I think it really does, and I would be a long way from that in relation to any sort of mediation, whether commercial or family or organizational, because I actually believe that it is who we are that is more important perhaps than the skills that we bring. And, if you look at mediators who are really virtuosic, it has to do with the presence that they bring, the qualities they bring, the kind of relationships they're able to forge. And that comes from a lot of self-knowledge and then a willingness to be transparent. Yes, I do think so.
I've got a couple of thoughts, actually. One about bringing presence. Actually, presents, not gifts. That's what you meant, right? That's what I've been going wrong all along, I think.
Too bad. No, it was CE, not TS. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
I'm in the wrong job. I should have stuck to what I'm good at: delivering presents rather than being present.
How do you feel about chimneys?
But coming back to the idea of having a PhD in theology, it strikes me that accomplishes a couple of things. One, just having the credibility with all the parties that actually, you come with some, a deep understanding of, the history, the context, so I think that's, on the one hand, really useful. And secondly, as you say, just to kind of enrich the conversation.
Well, absolutely. And I'm just mindful about a joke that's very, very common in Ireland, Northern Ireland, where the question is asked, but I'm a Buddhist, so I'm not Catholic or Protestant, so what should I do? And then the answer is, well, you have to disclose whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant Buddhist. And so I think that there are traps there. We can get over-identified and kind of locked in one particular idea or other's idea of what a particular religious identity is. I think we need to have more fluidity than that. But on the other hand, I think there's something very useful about being able to be fluent in the language of theology and the language of cosmology and, how the bigger picture relates to what we choose to do day to day. Because for someone of religious conviction, the bigger picture is completely and directly related to what we do day to day. And in the secular world, that's often missed.
Mm. So you started off by saying one of the purposes of this gathering was to learn from the experience of interveners, practitioners, mediators, conflict engagement folks in Northern Ireland, yes. and actually understanding what's required, what's needed to make these big shifts. What, if you were to sit back and go, okay, I've got some kind of insight into some of these things that are required to achieve these big shifts, what came out of it?
Well, certainly I think anyone who has been involved in this work would say that it takes a lot of time and a lot of relationship building and the willingness to step outside the labels of who is a radical actor and should not be talked to and who is not. And I would also suggest that one of the things that I think was hugely interesting in the gathering was the work that Nadia did with one of our participants in relation to using systemic constellation work to take a different look at a particular conflict on which he was working. And so I think what we have to do is we have to truly become multimodal and be able to put on different sets of glasses at different times to try to shake up or disrupt our own images of any particular situation, as well as the images of those who are involved in it.
Just, the personification of shaking it up and changing it.
Well done.
I just wish I had different glasses I could take on and off, but I don't have my comedy glasses at hand.
Oh, that's the same.
But no, I
was just going to say, one of the things that Alan and I were talking about before the show was, was some of the sessions in the gathering, and also the constellation work, and the idea of stripping, finding ways or techniques of intervention, such as the use of systemic structural constellations, to strip a conflict of its content. Right, and have a look at the dynamics in a really different way, because we can't be without our prejudices and what we think we know about something.
Exactly.
And that was powerful.
I think that's so true. I think we need to be able to look at the architecture of a conflict, and we need design thinking to be able to come toward these kinds of multi-layered, multi-dimensional conflicts from new places, because the state of the world actually calls us to do that.
Can you say a little bit more about design thinking?
Well, I've just been thinking that if I were to design my own professional development for the next year, it would involve taking courses in design thinking, because I'm really interested in how people who work with design thinking do come toward issues and problems in new ways and in different ways. And I think that those of us in the conflict engagement world could actually learn a great deal from that. I've had a couple of students do papers on that and found it really illuminating. So I wouldn't go into the specifics because I don't feel that I know enough to do that, but I think there's something very fruitful there. And I think that what we need to do is bring a whole repertoire of different approaches to the analysis and the engagement of the conflicts. The other side is the engagement side, so it would involve doing things with actual parties that are outside business as usual. And I know Nadia and Alaji both have thought a lot about embodiment and the importance of physically enacting change. And so, what happens if you get actors in a religious conflict to do things that seem to have nothing to do with the conflict and yet have the capacity to be spaces for self-reflection and spaces where new perspectives can come in relation to others.
So what's next? Where's this go? Where are you going to take this, Michelle?
Well, I was so encouraged, actually, by the people who were at the gathering and who are taking on what I think are commonly understood to be quite insoluble problems. In Jerusalem, for example, over Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, and many other contexts. And so where I'd like to take this is to stay in touch with people who really are engaged in this work and thinking about this work, so that knowledge is actually gathered and shared, and there's more and more momentum in a time when We face some very distressing and divisive thinking in the political domains all around us, in your part of the world and over here in the Americas as well. I think it's even more important that there be clear articulations of the importance of really engaging with religious actors and making sure that religion is part of the public discourse, not as a way to exclude others, but as a way to understand others more deeply.
I think that's lovely. That's I tell you what a way to end 2016 on a really positive and encouraging note. You know, when everything could be doom and gloom, but actually there are people doing the work, really committed to
Yes.
To change and doing the kind of stuff that, you know, I wouldn't do. I wish I could. I wish I had the courage. I wish I had the tenacity. I wish I had the knowledge and wisdom to do that. But you know, it's reassuring to know that people out there, and we need to get them on the show. Actually, Nadia, we need to find a way
Absolutely.
so that more people know about these projects, these initiatives, this great work, this body of theory that's being developed, so that maybe one day I can dip my toe in and do my bit.
Well, you know, you're very self-effacing, Alan, but actually I would say you can't not. That is, you know, all of the parties with whom you work as a mediator also bring their worldviews and whether they call themselves religious or not to the table. And I think we're always engaging with people with different worldviews, and that's part of what a really sophisticated mediator does. So I think part of it is actually just looking at what we already do and how we already serve as translators or bridges between people with quite different views of the world.
Translators and bridges.
Mm.
Just the metaphors just keep on coming.
They do. They are unstoppable, I'd say.
Well, Michelle, this has been a real delight. I really appreciate you getting up at some ridiculous hour to come and join us on this crazy show that we do. And I hope one day we'll be able to meet in person.
I look forward to that, and all the best for the show. Thank you for doing it. It's wonderful fun, and I think a really useful resource for so many people around the world. So congratulations both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know what really strikes me is how inadequate a 40-hour mediation course is to deal with conflicts such as this. I mean, there's a whole level of sophistication in mediation processes that many people in the field just miss, Nadia.
And I know this is a theme that you feel very strongly about, Aled, and I'm wondering if that's something that we might pack into a New Year's resolution for 2017.
Good idea. Let's come back to that later. Now, meanwhile, have you done your tax return this year? In some countries, the end of the calendar year is also the end of the fiscal year. So this is not just the Christmas stress, but also getting your tax returns done in time can be incredibly stressful. No one likes to get entangled in a long, tortuous conflict with the tax authorities. But if you do get stuck in one, would you want to mediate, Nadia?
Well, I think it might depend on how much tax they owed, but apparently in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS as it's called, has introduced a fast-track mediation program for the speedy resolution of issues concerning taxpayers. Now, Alec, I'm curious, tell us more about that.
Well, there are a couple of interesting features of this IRS scheme. For example, the mediator is an IRS employee who has been trained to act impartially. Now, I've always wondered how you could train someone to act impartially. That's the first point. I mean, how many days training would that take? 1, maybe 2, I don't know. Another point is that according to a report on this scheme, any mediator recommendation to resolve the issues is not binding. So the taxpayer would have a chance to go through the normal appeals process if she or he so wishes. In other words, we're looking at a process where the parties are offered a mediator who's also an employee and who is allegedly trained to be impartial and to then give a recommendation in relation to a proposed settlement.
Okay, so a couple of potential issues here. First, the mediator's capacity as an employee of the IRS to be perceived as impartial. That's one. Coupled with, and this seems to be the second point for me, their ability to make a recommendation about a proposed settlement. I mean, is that still mediation?
That's a good question. I think the pragmatic answer is that there are many processes in this world called mediation where the mediator is employed or at least engaged by a corporate party. Classic example within many organizations, workplace mediation is conducted by an internal mediator, for example.
Yeah, you're right. And there are also a lot of processes called mediation around the world where the mediator is more interventionist, offering various types of procedural or substantive advice to parties. So that's also not new in a way.
Yeah, I mean, like the Roma mediation that we covered in a previous show. But what happens when you combine those two elements? Now, I think that can make a difference because you have really given a mediator power and status that go way beyond the core idea of impartial facilitation.
It sounds like a very slippery slope to me and something that we need to pay attention to.
I think we certainly need to pay attention to that, but I think it illustrates the moving diversity, the shifting tectonic plates of mediation processes, and I think we've identified that as one of our global trends for 2016.
Indeed, we have the first of 5 trends that both sum up the year of 2016 and indicate where we might be heading in 2017.
Okay, so I shall give this a little whirl. For the first trend of Christmas, my true love gave to me diversity.
Lovely, Alan, just lovely. And I'd stick to my day job if I were you.
Okay, thank you very much. My day job as a newsreader, a very serious one. Okay, so diversity is a theme that we've covered in a number of shows, and it seems that there's a growing acceptance of diversity in mediation practice that moves well beyond the facilitative evaluative dichotomy.
We're increasingly seeing sophisticated variations to the classic mediation process, and these include variations such as settlement mediation, transformative mediation, diagnostic mediation, wise counsel, expert advisory, and of course facilitative mediation. And while most training courses still focus on facilitative mediation, even that is now starting to change. And in previous shows we've reported on training in the area of diagnostic mediation and in wise counsel and expert advisory forms of mediation. And in addition, we're also starting to see policy initiatives, such as those by the Hong Kong Department of Justice that specifically embrace different approaches to mediation and move beyond the facilitative mediation model.
Okay. So moving on to the second trend that we've identified, which is mediation advocacy. Now, it's a fact of life that lawyers will be involved in many mediations, particularly where they involve litigation matters. This is becoming a specialized form of legal practice known as mediation lawyering, mediation advocacy, mediation advising, or mediation representation. Now, in many jurisdictions, there are specific obligations on lawyers in terms of statutes, rules of court, and lawyer codes of conduct applicable in mediation.
Yeah, and I think what we're really seeing is greater recognition that the skills of mediation advocacy or mediation lawyering are really different from the skills associated with trial advocacy or trial lawyering, if you like. And so, we're needing more and more education and training to support this cultural shift in the legal profession. And again, literature is starting to support that. There's an increased number of training courses around this, and also a number of certification programs, for example, that of the International Mediation Institute, which offers a certification for approved training programs on mediation advocacy.
Very interesting. So trend number 3 on the theme of international mediation is the opening up of international mediation practice. Now, the profile of cross-border disputants is changing, and with it the nature of international dispute resolution and the growth of mediation in this area. The increasing accessibility of the internet and the corresponding growth of small businesses engaging in cross-border transactions has contributed to a significantly higher volume of international transactions and dramatically changed the nature of contemporary business.
Absolutely. All sorts of people are finding themselves engaged in cross-border disputes, including mums and dads, online consumers, small business operators, and chiefs in remote Pacific villages, for example. And this increasing diversity in the characteristics and needs of disputants in cross-border matters has really enhanced the appeal of mediation as a flexible, informal, and relatively cost-effective forum.
You see this reflected in the increasing international institutionalization of mediation. That was a
mouthful.
Yeah. International commercial arbitration institutions such as the ICC in Paris and the LCIA in London began to offer cross-border mediation, while national organizations such as ACDC in Sydney, that was a band back in my day, the ADR Centre in Rome, CEDA in London, CPR in New York, and JAMS in California began to extend their existing mediation services and facilities across borders.
Yeah, so this is something that's been happening, I think, in recent years. You've started to see the arbitration institutions moving, the mediation institutions moving, and then more recently, what you've seen is a couple of institutions being set up specifically for international mediation practice, right? And that's, for example, the Singapore International Mediation Centre. And then on top of that, there are a number of very specific programs focused on cross-border mediation in particular areas, like sport. Yeah. And there's even one institution that focuses on the mediation of international ice hockey disputes.
I think
very important.
Very important. I think we covered in one of our earlier shows, which was an informal mediation around the breakfast table with an Aussie rules dispute. But if you haven't seen that edition, I think it was in the first or the second show, go and watch that now. And moving swiftly on to trend number 4, which is the national and international professionalization of mediation.
That's right. Well, you've seen, the national trends towards the professionalization of mediation through accreditation standards, and in most countries, notably not in England and the UK and not in the US, but that's not for a lack of trying, but in many countries you find that there are now national accreditation or professional standards for mediators. And what's starting to emerge now more strongly, and I think this is a big trend of 2016, is how to make that national shift, sort of that national movement into an international movement. And what you're seeing is the mutual recognition among different national standards, sort of like bilateral treaties happening between national mediator accreditation bodies. And you're also seeing at least one body, the International Mediation Institute, going one step further, and they're trying to work with mediator accrediting bodies around the world, in particular ones which offer a national standard, to establish an international certification for professional mediators.
I think that's going to be an interesting challenge watching that. I mean, even though it's a trend for 2016, I think it's going to be one to watch for 2017, 2018. How do you get that sort of parity between national organizations and get that reassurance that if you're hiring a mediator for a cross-border dispute, anyway, I think that's a really interesting one, and it kind of feeds in to our final trend, which is the international legal framework. Tell us about that, Nadia.
Well, you saw, similar to the professionalisation trend, you've seen regulatory activity really focus on setting up a national legal framework for mediation in any number of countries. And you've seen it develop differently in common law jurisdictions compared to civil law jurisdictions. Civil law jurisdictions tending to gravitate towards a comprehensive national piece of legislation, and common law jurisdictions being quite different. But what you've really started to see emerging in the last few years, and a lot of attention has been put on this in 2016, is an international legal framework. Now, that's something that's been very strong and has existed for a long time in the arbitration world, and many arbitrators and many international lawyers in particular have criticised mediation and said it's not suitable for cross-border disputes because it lacks a robust international legal framework. But now you just need to look, for example, at these types of international legal instruments. The United Nations, UNCITRAL, have introduced the model law on international commercial conciliation. That was back in 2002, but every year more and more countries and jurisdictions are adopting this law, and in 2016 we have 28 jurisdictions, including a number of US states, that have adopted this model law on international commercial conciliation. We also have the European Union Directive on Mediation, where 29 EU member states have implemented regulatory instruments on, thank you, Alec, specifically on cross-border mediation.
Okay.
And in 2016, probably the biggest regulatory news in this within this theme is that the UNCITRAL Working Group on Arbitration and Conciliation are this year and continuing next year deliberating on the preparation of an instrument on the enforcement of international mediated settlement agreements. So they're still thinking about, do we want a multilateral convention? Do we want model provisions, another model law? What will it exactly look like? A number of people are very excited about the possibility of having a multilateral convention because in their minds that would put mediation on a par with arbitration. Arbitration has that sort of convention, which means that arbitral awards have expedited enforcement internationally. What if we could do that for mediation?
I don't want to be pedantic, but when you say the working group on arbitration and conciliation,
yes,
why isn't it on arbitration, the working group on arbitration, conciliation and mediation, or arbitration and mediation?
When you move your head, these things keep going, but I'm concentrating, don't you worry. Well, look, that's a great question, and I have an answer which is sort of based on different comments, and who knows what the real answer is. But I think the answer is to a large extent historic. If you look historically at the work of the United Nations, which goes back decades in relation to conciliation. So they worked originally on arbitration and also had conciliation rules as early as 1980, I think. And that was really before mediation sort of became more popular. And also there's a linguistic difference. In some countries also the term for mediation is the same as for conciliation in different languages. And so, when you're looking at translating, which terms are people comfortable with. And if you also look at the model law, that was adopted in 2002. And now we're looking 14 years later. So, whether we shift the term to mediation or not, the question is, does it really make a difference? Yeah. I think the answer to your question is it's historic. Yeah. But if you look at the definition, it very clearly includes mediation.
Very illuminating. So I think we can go informative, tick, outrageous, tick.
Big tick today.
And illuminating as ever from Nadia. So there we have it, the 5 global trends in mediation for 2016. So our question of the week, I think it's going to be a question of the week, a question of the year, like a reflective practitioner question, but also a visionary crystal ball question. if mediation were a person, what would his or her New Year's resolution be? Answers on a postcard? No, not on a postcard. In the box below the screen where it says comments, please put your comments here. Write your resolutions in there. And Nadia, do you have? If mediation was a person, what would the New Year's resolution be?
Well, perhaps one of my New Year's resolutions would be, if I were mediation as a person, would be to work more collaboratively with my arbitration colleagues, because I think arbitrators and mediators still tend to live and work in silos. So that would be a New Year's resolution, to be proactive about that.
Like that a lot, yes.
And also floss more.
The floss more. Oh, that's deep. That's well deep. That's well deep. Okay, so mine is going to be, if mediation was a person, to take myself more seriously. That's even deeper. Figure that one out.
I think you're well on the way to doing that, Alan.
So Nadia, we're coming to the end of a lovely year, 2016. It's certainly been illuminating, it's been interesting, and it's definitely been a lot of fun. Now, before we sign off, I think from the both of us, we just want to say a big, massive thank you and acknowledgement to the unsung heroes that make this show possible, that trawl the streets day and night searching for the latest, hottest off the press mediation news, so that you, sitting there in the comfort of your own home, don't even have to leave the bed to just keep abreast of the latest, greatest stories. They for nights on end sleeping outside the offices of the South China Morning Post just to bring you that story today. Pavlina, Pritika, John, thank you. Well, that's it. I think looking forward to 2017, looking forward to kicking the year off with our 2017 show. And all that's left for me to say is thank you, Nadia. And it's a goodbye from me at Mediator Academy HQ in London.
And thank you, Alan. It's been a great year for Mediator Academy. Goodbye to everyone from Mediator Academy in Berlin.
See you all next year.